In Dickens' A Christmas Carol, the story starts out by showing us Ebenezer Scrooge at his worst. Rude to everyone, especially those who seem to enjoy Christmas. Cruel and uncaring. And over the course of the story, Scrooge sees the error of his ways and discovers the joy of giving and caring for others. But Charles Dickens had an ulterior motive in writing this story. His primary reason was to highlight the extreme poverty, the inadequate educational system, and especially the cruelties insisted upon children in England at the time. But there are a lot of different levels to this story of Ebenezer Scrooge. My favorite part of A Christmas Carol is how we discover the steps along the way that turn Scrooge into the man we meet at the beginning of the story. Because as a young boy, he didn't start out that way, but he was sent away to boarding school first. That wasn't an unusual thing for families of that time, especially if they had any money or any position in society. But it did separate Ebenezer from his family, and especially his younger sister, Fan, the family member who showed him the most love. That separation from his sister and then her early death as a young adult deeply wounded him. Still, Ebenezer was capable of fun and enjoyment, as we see in the celebration at Fezziwig's and his engagement to Belle. But his greed and need to hold on to wealth, to find some safety for himself, is what finally drove Belle away. And that seemed to have been the last stroke that turned Ebenezer Scrooge into the loveless, uncaring man that most people know. That story reminds me that there is nothing more painful or possibly life-altering than having love or loved ones taken away from you. Now, I suppose you might think it's a little strange. This is my favorite part of the story, but let me explain a little bit. For some reason, like many of us, but I seem to be especially aware of it, death has been a special part of my life, as long as I can remember. My earliest childhood memory is when I was a young child of 5. I spent my birthday with my grandmother Maggie in her hospital room as she was dying, and a few days later, refused to get out of the car because I would not go to her graveside. When I was a young boy in Cub Scouts, one of our pack members was hit and killed by a car, and I remember vividly when they took all of us young scouts to the funeral home to pay our respects, and he was lying there in an open coffin. Over the years, like many of us, I've had a lot of friends and family die earlier than they should have. When I worked in media, I covered stories of accidents and violence that resulted in death. And as a pastor, I've officiated funerals for people I've been very close to and many others that weren't even part of my congregation. This past month's been especially intense for Sue and I. My beloved college choir director and friend died unexpectedly. A few days later, a member of Sue's early youth groups, together with his wife, was swept away in his vehicle during flash flooding down in northern Arkansas that took their lives. Our brother-in-law, Mike Moyer, married to my sister Paula, died after a 13-year battle with cancer, shortly after what we thought had been a successful operation. A good college friend of both Sue and I, someone we shared a house with when we were first married, Dan Nedrow, died this week from a stroke following a fall. And then Thursday, Gary Blankers passed away after what we thought had been a weekend with some improvement. Gary's kindness and patience made him a standout among a congregation already filled with kind people. Now, while there's been an abundance of sadness with all of these deaths, there has also been much love and compassion. When my choir director died, members of the choirs from across the country shared stories online with each other, and we shared a lot of those with his partner, a wonderful woman who appreciated being made part of his special family. When my brother-in-law passed, my sister was overwhelmed with condolences and appreciation from a great many people he'd worked with over the years. Probably the crowning moment, I wish Mike could have seen it, was there was a special certificate sent to him from the Kansas City Chiefs, extending their sympathy and stating that Mike would forever remain part of the Chiefs' kingdom. Gary's death was the most recent, but the outpouring of love and appreciation is already immense. And I wouldn't expect anything less from this congregation, especially for a person who one of his primary reasons for living, he said, was to serve others. Now, in the midst of all these turbulent emotions and instances, there is one thing that stands out for me: joy. Not the joy that seems giddy with excitement, but a Christian joy that John Piper described as a good feeling in the soul, produced by the Holy Spirit as the Spirit causes us to see the beauty of Christ in the Word and in the world. And so even as we prepare to celebrate the birth of the Christ child, Emmanuel, God with us, I hold on to what for me is the joy and the most important aspect of Jesus' life and death: his resurrection. Now, among Christians, there's a lot of disagreement about the meaning and purpose of Jesus' life and death. I've always believed that the teachings of Jesus were there for the purpose of helping us connect more deeply with God and with each other, to teach us how to best live as we seek to help create God's kingdom on earth. As Jesus said in John's Gospel, I came so that they might live life to its fullest. But one of the great obstacles to living life to its fullest is our fear of loss and pain. Look what it did to Ebenezer Scrooge. Every time he experienced a loss of love in his life, his heart became a bit harder, until he seemed to forget completely how it felt to love others. The ghost of Christmas yet to come showed Ebenezer that if he continued, he would die without any love in his life. But the reality would have been that Ebenezer would have died a long time before that, long before his body quit working. It's easy for us, too, to wall ourselves off from love and joy when difficult things happen. To protect our hearts from the pain of loss, we a lot of times build up walls that we think are going to protect us. But the Chinese philosopher Lao Tzu may have put it best when he said, being deeply loved by someone gives you strength, while loving someone deeply gives you courage. The God that created us to live filled with love, hope, peace, and joy also knows how easy it is for us to make choices that do just the opposite. Opening ourselves up to loving others means we also open ourselves up to pain, especially to the pain of losing those we love. That's why I believe God gave us the greatest gift of all, not simply the presence of Jesus in the world or his teachings, but the resurrection. There are many people that will claim that the primary purpose of Jesus coming into the world and being a sacrifice on our behalf was to take our place in God's punishment for sinful choices made in life. But I've always asked, if that was the case, why then the resurrection? There would have been no need for that, unless you think God was simply trying to show off his power and say, look, I have control over life and death, which we believe anyway. I believe that the resurrection was an incredible gift from God to say, look, you don't have to be afraid. You will not be separated for eternity from those you love. You will never be separated from those you love. In the resurrection, we have a promise that the pain we feel when we lose a loved one to death will not last forever. The love we have for one another does not disappear, and our separation is only temporary. You know, we just did a baptism a few minutes ago, and one of the things we said is, when Arya was taking part in the waters of baptism, she was delivered from death to life. We were asked to bind her to the household of faith, to strengthen her with joy until the day that God makes all things new. The love we have for one another does not disappear, and our separation is only temporary. Our friend Dan that died this week had been one of the first of our friends to get excited about the fact that Sue and I were returning to the Midwest. See, in 1985, we had moved from Iowa down to Arkansas and then made a progressive move east further every time we took another position or went to seminary or took a call. We moved further east until we were in New Jersey for the last 12 years. And in all those years, we rarely had a time to visit with old friends in person. Mostly, of course, like many of us, we went to see family on the vacation time we did have. So Dan was excited that we were going to be back, and we made plans that, of course, after we got through the busyness of the first initial months here at GCPC and also the holidays, that we could get together. And then his accident happened. We have the inevitable sorrow that comes when you have a friend that loses their life suddenly, and especially when you wish you hadn't waited to see each other, to think about what it would have been nice to be able to see each other again after so many years. But I always hold on to the deep thought and faith that we are not separated. I think it was put best by a gentleman by the name of Henry Scott Holland, who delivered a poem and a sermon back in 1910. But every time I've shared it with someone, it really makes a difference because it expresses, I think, better than anything, what it's really like in the life to come. Death is nothing at all. It does not count. I've only slipped away into the next room. Everything remains as it was. The old life that we lived so fondly together is untouched and unchanged. Whatever we were to each other, that we are still. Call me by the old familiar name. Speak of me in the easy way which you always used. Put no sorrow in your tone. Laugh as we always laughed at the little jokes we enjoyed together. Play, smile, think of me, pray for me. Let my name always be the household word that it always was. Let it be spoken without effort. Life means all that it ever meant. It is the same as it ever was. There is unbroken continuity. Why should I be out of mind just because I am out of sight? I am but waiting for you, for an interval, somewhere very clear, just around the corner. All is well. Nothing is hurt, nothing is lost. One brief moment and all will be as it was before, and how we shall laugh at the trouble of parting when we meet again. We often use the phrase, when someone dies, they've gone home to be with God. But we also believe that God is always with us, always present. And so I always believe that the loved ones that we've lost to death are just around the corner, just out of sight, but still present with us. I've heard many stories over the years of people who felt the presence of a loved one. Sue had a very close attachment to her grandmother, the one that taught her how to do crafts and sewing and so many of those things. And sometimes when Sue goes into her sewing room, she's had the experience of smelling her grandmother's perfume, even though it's been 20-some years since her grandmother passed away. And I always think it's just Grandma letting her know, I'm still here. I'm close by. We're not promised that we will not have sorrow or that we will have times to mourn in our lives, but we are promised that we will have joy and joy again. The promise of the resurrection and what makes it possible for us to live in life fully in this life. It's the resurrection that makes it possible for us to live with joy. Amen.